The Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, and the World Bank Group President, David Malpass, today flagged off the 2023 spring meetings of the two institutions. In a fireside chat, the heads of the two global institutions discussed the complex challenges facing the world economy and the way forward. Let's take an excerpt.
We are starting off the week of meetings of the World Bank IMF meetings, the IMF World Bank spring meetings with a big agenda. We want to talk about the world economy, about the debt problems facing developing countries. But the overall theme is how do we get better outcomes for people around the world, and especially for people that are on the lower end of the income scale, people in developing countries and people in middle-income countries and advanced economies that are suffering from lower incomes and from the costs of climate change, for instance. And so that's the thrust of the spring meetings. And I wonder, Kristalina, IMF does a lot of look at the global economic outlook. We are worried about the slowness of growth now and the prospect that it might stay slow. What do you think, and what are the big challenges?
Well, David, let me first thank you for honoring this tradition for us to start the meetings week together. You're right, we are yet again assembling our membership at a time of high uncertainty. The recovery we so much are hoping for, a robust recovery, is still a bit elusive. Why? Because we do have a significant inflation problem. That means central banks have to continue to keep interest rates higher to combat it, and that is on the way of restoring the prospects for robust growth. We have seen that this rapid transition from low interest rates, abundant liquidity, to high interest rates and much less available liquidity has exposed vulnerabilities in the financial sector that made the task of policymakers even harder. So in that context, what we are projecting for this year is, despite the remarkable resilience of consumer spending in the United States, in Europe, despite the uplift from China's reopening, global growth would remain below 3% as we projected it earlier this year. And what is more concerning, it would remain around 3% for the next 5 years. That does not give us high hope for meeting the aspirations of people, especially poor people around the world, and most importantly, poor people in poor countries. Let me stress 3 issues in that context. The first one is that this picture of growth is divergent. There are emerging markets that are doing better. But for frontier markets, for the poor countries, the future is not so bright. And in terms of income per capita growth, poor countries would remain below income per capita growth in middle-income countries. Dangerous divergence. 2, we have been wrestling with one crisis after another, one shock after another. And that has pushed on the back burden the longer-term agenda of structural reforms that are paramount to uplift productivity. And with productivity remaining low, the prospects for growth are low. And 3, the ropes that tie us together have become weaker over the last years. Fragmentation is deepening, and what it means is that what has generated tremendous impetus for growth and prosperity over the last 3 decades an integrated economy is being negatively impacted. We have done research at the IMF that shows that just the costs of trade fragmentation can run as high as 7% of global GDP over the years. So these meetings are an opportunity for us not only to talk about the immediate priorities of restoring price stability and safeguarding financial stability, but also about the longer-term prospects of growth and how prosperity can be an achievable objective for the lower income countries. Which takes me to you. How do you see that?
Exactly right. And as we look at it, the elements of growth into the future, it's important that there be more investment in small businesses, in new businesses, and that means a flow of capital. And a worry that we have for developing countries is the capital flow right now is out of developing countries. So for many of the developing countries, it looks like they're in a phase of decapitalization rather than recapitalization. That goes with your point that instead of having convergence, meaning people with lower incomes growing faster than people with higher incomes. So convergence toward a higher level, that's not happening right now. It's actually a divergence, and that's gravely concerning. That means inequality, that means fragility for countries, and we see more countries falling into fragility. One of the concerns with with high prices now, high prices are being applied to food and fertilizer, and a concern for the poorest around the world is the farmers are not able to plant, and if they don't get fertilizer, often they won't plant for the crop cycle because they know that their yields will be too low. And so an urgent need, and we've worked on this over the last 6 months, but it's still has room to come together, is that the fertilizer resources go to the people that can pay the most, and that means those farmers are providing the global crop supplies. And so that's a challenge. Right now, for example, wheat supplies globally are at a low level. China has substantial stockpiles, but most of the other countries have drawn down their stockpiles, and so that points to a period of strain on global food supplies. I wanted to pick up on your point about the trade fragmentation. So as we think about that, trade is vital to productivity within the world. People swapping goods in their village, within their country, and across borders is a way to add value, to create more productivity. And to the extent that that breaks down into regional blocks or protectionist blocks, that's a concern. And right now, that's the direction of travel for the world as it looks to stop the globalization and to reverse it. The risk is that it will come out with unproductive structures, and that also will weigh on world growth. And I guess I'll finish on your opening point that just the move from very low interest rates, I think artificially low interest rates, and the capital allocation that went with it, meaning investors all over the world were making decisions based on the idea that it was 0% interest rates for a long period of time, low for long, and that misallocated the capital. So to bring that back to productive uses is really hard. If you say, well, we're going to keep the interest rates at current levels or go to a more normal levels of interest rates, that means losses for banks that had a duration mismatch, as we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. And so there's losses being allocated by the world system now, but we should keep in mind, if you just lower the interest rates back down, it won't solve the problem. What that means is that people will suffer from inflation. The dollar weakens, the inflation rate goes back up, and that hurts the poor the most. So I think there has to be a goal of finding a low inflation environment and dollar stability for the future.
Very much agree with that. Central banks do have a preoccupation to bring inflation down. And it is paramount because without price stability, there is no sound foundation for investments and for growth. Their job has become more complicated because of the exposure of vulnerabilities in the financial sector. That means attention has to be paid to financial stability. Fortunately, they have different tools they can apply to deal with these two different problems. They can fight inflation by keeping interest rates higher for longer, and they can provide targeted liquidity should there be a need to bring down risks to financial stability. What we have seen is a remarkable, rapid and effective intervention by policymakers, primarily central banks, but not only. Financial authorities, supervisory authorities, regulatory authorities. Once there was a problem exposed, they acted swiftly. And this is very different to what happened during the global financial crisis. So there is something to celebrate. We learned a lesson, we act on it. However, when we look into the future, the problem that you outlined, allocation of capital, it has to be recognized that without the confidence that productivity is going to go up, how does it go up? It goes up when there is effective investment in education, skills development, adaptability to changing labor market needs. It gets up when there is effective investment in research and innovation, and it goes into private sector performance. It doesn't stay locked into monopolies that only have access to these new discoveries. And productivity goes up when division of labor that trade provides is effectively energized. I do hope that as we have these meetings to talk about the immediate pressing priorities of price stability, financial stability, we will pay more attention to how the world can go into a higher growth path. I apologize.
This is vital to the world. Getting the growth rate higher is important for people's jobs. It's important also for the migration patterns of countries. You know, if we're in a world where people have to migrate to other countries in order to have access to capital, that is a challenge. And they're being pushed by climate change. They're being pushed by their own countries having domestic debt problems. And so that pressure is substantial. So I think there's an urgency to the policy changes. Now, I want to inquire on one specific area. As the central banks raise interest rates, they've described it as a goal of reducing demand within the economy. I think there really has to be much more awareness that the long-term solution is through much greater supply, yes. And that means short-term financing for small businesses, for medium-sized businesses. Right now, somehow we fell into a cycle, I think, over the last 10 years where the central banks were buying long maturity assets, and that really fundamentally changed the direction of the world toward bigness. Governments can issue 10-year bonds. Small businesses don't issue 10-year bonds. And so one of the things I hope we could do is really have a clear view. How do you get back to a world where short-term financing is available to businesses? We're not there.
I very much agree with this, David. It matters to everyone. It matters a lot to emerging markets and developing economies. We know that in emerging markets and developing economies, if the small and medium-sized enterprises are suffocated, there is simply no way to generate the jobs a growing population demands from in these countries. So that question of how we think about financing, accessibility to finance for everyone, especially for women-led business, is something that the World Bank has researched for quite some time. This is again on the list of issues that got pushed down because of this shock upon shock upon shock. And I want to say we cannot finish this conversation without recognizing that one of these shocks, the senseless war in Ukraine, can go away by just a decision taken by the country that invaded Ukraine to stop the war.